My name's Staff Sergeant Jimmy Edmonds. I've been with the Sheriff's Office in Columbia County for 27 years. At 9 o'clock in the morning, we received a 911 call, and the day took a turn from there.
Yes, I'm over here at 229 Hot Springs. The back door's broken. I had come over here to do some work, and I called the owner, but she's not here. I don't think. I hollered in the door, and I did no response.
The 911 caller that day was Mitchell Cozart. He was the handyman. He was just concerned about the homeowner because she was supposed to be there for him to do some work. After we received the 911 call, we get to the house. We immediately go around to the back. The door is shattered, completely shattered. As we make entry into the house, it's been ransacked. The mattresses were flipped over. All the drawers have been pulled out. As we're still clearing the house, then we start seeing blood on the walls, on the floor. There was a tremendous amount of blood, and it appeared there was a struggle. We open the garage door, and we find Kay Parsons, the homeowner, in a pool of blood by her car. And laying next to her body was a baseball bat, and there was also a claw hammer.
She had been beaten really all over. It's obvious she had been fighting because she had defensive wounds as well.
Could you imagine being struck with a claw hammer and then be beat with a baseball bat? It's close to torture.
Kay had a very faint heartbeat, so she was immediately rushed straight to the hospital to see if they could save her life. In my 27 years in law enforcement, I've never seen somebody beaten this bad. It sickened me to my stomach.
This was just a mom and a wife who was just taking her son, Derek, to school and came home and was brutally beaten.
You never heard anybody say anything bad about Kay Parsons. She put her family first. She put her kid on a pedestal. Ideal mom.
I can't imagine somebody being left that way. I mean, it's sad.
That morning, things got even scarier when investigators discovered that the house next door has been broken into as well.
So now we have 2 burglaries. I'm thinking, do we have a cold-blooded murderer on the loose?
Was this random? Who's gonna be next? There was, for sure, a sense of fear.
We go over to the house next door. We see that the same ransacking inside the house, things strewn about, drawers pulled open. We definitely were afraid we were gonna find another body or somebody that was severely injured. But luckily enough, they weren't home. When I'm checking the backyard and I go to the back door, I find a small drop of blood on the back door. That told me that whoever did the burglary and the beating of Kay left there, went next door and committed another burglary. It didn't make sense to me. If you just committed a burglary and you beat someone so bad, why are you gonna go next door and do another burglary? You're not. You're gonna get out of that neighborhood as quick as possible to try to get away.
This felt more personal than a random attack. And so of course you start thinking like, why these 2 homes? Why these people?
Kay and David Parsons lived at 229 Hot Springs Drive. They were a loving family. The Sears family lived at 227 Hot Springs, which was next door. It was Becky Sears and her husband, Tony.
Becky had 2 sons from a previous marriage, Michael and Christopher Bowers. And then she had 3 sons, including 2 with Tony Sears. So a total of 5 boys. She was a busy mom.
The Parsons family and the Sears family, when they moved in, they became instant friends.
They did hang out all the time. They were always hanging out.
They all play tennis together. They got kids that are the same age that play baseball together. So they were pretty close.
From what Becky was saying, Kay was her best friend. From the way she was smiling, lit up, I could tell they had a good relationship.
They were in such similar phases of their life, raising children, husbands that were working and traveling for work a lot. They had a lot in common. Becky gets the phone call that there's been a break-in at her home and that Kay's been attacked. And she rushes back to her home.
After Becky gets to the scene, she was very distraught, and she keeps asking about Kay. How is Kay? How is Kay? She's not worried about her house or anything like that. She just got in the car and went to the hospital. Kay's husband, David, was out of town. He was in California on business. So he wasn't home during all this. I ended up having to call him on the phone and tell him what happened. He said he was immediately trying to get on a plane to get back here as quick as possible. I decided to go down to the hospital to check on Kay because I didn't know if she was alive or dead at that time. When David gets back, they explained to him that she was brain dead. There was no brain activity. So he made the decision to pull the plug.
Kay Parsons died in the hospital Thursday from her injuries. Investigators from Columbia and Richmond counties have been at the family home on Hot Springs Drive looking for evidence. The normally quiet and safe neighborhood is shocked.
It made me nervous because this happened literally up the street from where I worked. So you automatically think, I live in a neighborhood. Am I gonna get attacked? Am I safe in my own home?
I'm driving back and there was a lot of pressure on my shoulders and the whole neighborhood is just up in arms and I'm just trying to figure out my next lead and where I'm gonna go from here. So step one, we wanted to bring in Mitchell Kozar, the handyman, who was supposed to be there to do some work on the back door at Kay's house.
I think I got over about 8:45, somewhere right around in there. And
Mitchell, explained to us why he was there. And that's when he found the back door was shattered and he called 911.
Then I seen that boy the next door neighbor sitting down on a rock across the street. And that made me kind of suspicious right there, because I said, what if this guy's a lookout right here? I mean, it might be, something going on here.
We were able to determine that boy was Michael Bowers, Becky's son that lived at 227. He was found sitting on this rock, which raised my suspicion that it was kind of odd. Why is he sitting on a rock across from two houses that have been burglarized? While on scene, I just casually asked Michael, let me see the bottom of your shoes. So he lifted up his shoes and I found a shard of glass that was stuck in the bottom of his tennis shoes. And that glass in Michael's shoe was similar to the back door. At this point in time in the investigation, Michael is my number one person of interest that I'm delving into deeper until we get a phone call and it takes a big turn and twist.
I got the 911. Somebody came out from behind the trees and he shot me.
You know where you hit at?
My legs.
What's the name of the office?
It's Healing Hands Physical Therapy.
Now, what's the name?
Becky Sears.
Immediately you're like, whoa, how could this happen 2 days in a row? What is going on with these two families? Who is targeting them?
News 12, first to 5 starts now.
2 Columbia County women are attacked in 2 days, and they happen to live next door to one another.
One was beaten to death, the other is wounded in the leg. Today we're learning more about the attacks on these 2 neighbors.
We were like, what is going on with these 2? Did they get involved in something they shouldn't have gotten involved in? Because it seemed like they were being targeted.
Thursday night, while Sears was locking up at the center off Highland Avenue, someone shot at her, grazing her leg, and then threatened her, saying if they didn't get their money, next time they would shoot her in the face.
I was thinking of Becky's son. Michael is somehow involved in this. He had glass on his shoes somehow. There's some kind of connection between these 2 houses, and I don't know what it is, but I'm missing something. We started doing a background check on Michael. We found out he'd had a hairy past.
He'd been in some trouble. He'd been arrested before.
Michael had developed a drug problem. He was having to go to a methadone clinic, trying to deal with that.
I mean, I think that there was definitely a different dynamic for both of the older boys. Michael had been going through a lot in his life, and then there's Christopher, who hadn't been in trouble like that.
Christopher owns his own house. He's got a full-time job. He's kind of got his life together.
Both boys were treated kind of differently in the family. Michael was becoming more of the problem child out of the 2, and Christopher was more of the doting son.
Becky is fed up with Michael and was sitting saying she was going to kick him out.
So all arrows were kind of pointing toward Michael. Here we have this young man on the scene, sitting outside of these 2 homes with drug issues, and, you know, drugs go hand in hand with robberies and burglaries.
So I bring him in and start interviewing him. I'm gonna be point blank with you. If you knew anything about this, you would tell me, right?
Absolutely.
When was the last time you took some methadone?
Today.
So I'm thinking there's Michael is trying to get money for drugs, or maybe somebody owes somebody some money for drugs. Maybe Kay just got caught up into something that Michael did, but there's some kind of connection between these 2 families. I'm just not seeing what it is right yet, and it's driving me crazy. Then I get a phone call, and it just turns my investigation 180 degrees. Jail staff tells me that they have an inmate named Jerry Jacobs that wanted to talk to me about what had happened, that he heard on the news.
Jerry Jacobs was incarcerated in the county jail for a minor traffic accident.
I sit down with him in the interview room, and he just looks at me and he says, I think my sister was involved in Kay's death. So I find out Jerry Jacobs is Becky Sears' brother. I said, what? It just blew my mind.
She come to me one day, or there in the parking lot crying, and I was like, you know, what's wrong? And that's whenever she told me she was having the affair.
One of the bombshells that Jerry tells investigators is that his sister was having an affair with Kay Parsons' husband, David, which changes the dynamic of this whole crime.
She'd just call and say, well, something like, you know, Tony, he don't do this for me, he doesn't do that for me, and David does.
I'm kind of shocked, but then the pieces start falling together, because there's my connection between these 2 women and these 2 houses.
Jerry knew that there were 2 people who did not want Kay in the picture.
She was crying, and she had asked me if I knew of anyone, or if I knew a way that we could do this to kill Kay and make it look like an accident.
Jerry tells me that Becky is basically begging him to kill Kay.
And then, you know, I'd be like, well, Becky, that's okay. You know, sometimes we all feel that way about people. You know, she's like, no. She's like, I really want her dead. She said, can we do this? And I'm like, no, we can't.
I've got to give him credit for, you know, coming forward and telling us what he knew, even though it was his sister.
Jerry really helps investigators, you know, paint this picture of somebody who had motive, who wanted Kay out of the picture. In the beginning, you feel horrible for David Parsons, this father who's just lost his wife, his high school sweetheart, but it changes the way you look at him when you know that there was an affair happening. You then realize that Kay was even more of a victim in this.
When the news about the affair came out, I think the investigators immediately became suspicious of David. You just happened to be in California at the time your wife is murdered.
Did he know what happened? What was he involved? You know, was this a plan?
It's an interview with Mr. David Parsons. Today's date is March 27th, 2009.
First thing I asked him is, tell me about the affair between you and Becky Sears. And he just drops his head.
Summer of last year, we all started hanging out, playing tennis and stuff like that. That one day, she said, you know why I suck so bad at tennis is because you distract me out there. You know, kind of, you know, a little flirt thing going on.
Then it started going into phone calls and text messages. Then they started meeting up. They started meeting up to have sex. They would have sex in each other's house when their spouses were away. So this has been going on for a while.
Rebecca was obsessed with David Parsons. They had a passionate relationship.
I mean, I think Becky was really hopeful that somehow, you know, she could be with David full time. At some point, she decided that she wanted to tell her husband about the affair. And so David realized, like, she had crossed a line.
And he ended the affair. And he said Becky didn't take it very well.
It was February 18th. I had another phone that she had gotten, and I gave her the phone back and said, you know, I'm stopping this.
I then explained to him I had his phone records. And I said, I know you talked to Becky the night before that this all happened. And he looked at me, he said, well, yes, I did talk to her.
Tuesday night, we had a long conversation.
About?
Nothing in particular, like, we just talked for a little while about what was going on, and then we got involved in, you know, phone sex over the phone.
You know, this wasn't an affair that was long gone, that was over and done with. This was something that was happening up until the day of the murder.
I think David could very well possibly be involved in this crime, but what better alibi can you have than you're thousands of miles away in California? I wasn't convinced, you know, it was too convenient.
You're not going to do your son any good by withholding any information to go into prison.
Prison for what? For some kind of involvement in this with my wife?
If there is any.
Check everything you want to check, everywhere you want to check it.
I said, okay. So you supposedly broke it off with Becky, but you're still having phone sex with her. But he swore up and down throughout this interview that he had no idea that Becky would go this far to try to get rid of Kay.
I never thought that she would be able to, like, orchestrator or set something up like this.
Who knows what goes through people's mind? I do not know. Okay? Desperate people do desperate things.
How? She desperate for what?
You!
He's very forthcoming. He's giving me intimate details, stuff that is very embarrassing, to him. So I feel like he's telling me most of the truth. I have nothing to say that he was involved. And I don't believe he would do anything to hurt his son, Derek. And I don't think he would want to take his mother away from Derek.
So sorry, Derek.
I'm still thinking about Michael Bowers, Becky's son. Still thinking that Michael is somehow involved in this. But then, right at the end of the interview with David, he comes across with one more revelation.
One thing I thought about, I asked her who knew, if anybody else knew, and she did tell me that Christopher knew that she was with somebody else.
This was another bombshell dropped into the middle of the case. The only other person that really had knowledge about this affair is their son, Chris.
Christopher's, a very loyal son. Becky was confiding in him a lot about the affair, about troubles in her marriage. She was very candid with him. Becky Sears' brother, Jerry, knew that if there was a son that was sympathetic to his mother, it would be Christopher.
But she would call Christopher almost every night and cry and tell him stuff. And he would get off the phone. And I'm like, is that your mom? I'm like, yeah, what's wrong with her? You know what it is. You know what's wrong. I'm like, yeah. I was like, David again? He's like, yeah, David again.
She crossed a line in terms of just a mother-son relationship and what information she just shared with him.
So now, after all I've learned, I don't believe that Michael had anything to do with the crime. And I realized I've been focusing on the wrong son. Now, Christopher is becoming the #1 person of interest in my investigation. We start to dive into Christopher. We were able to discover that it was a really strange mother-son relationship between Becky and Christopher. Everybody called him a mama's boy, but it was to a different level.
He would do whatever it took to please his mom. As he got older, she would give him money. She bought him a car, a house.
Whatever Christopher wanted, Christopher got. But with all these gifts, there's definitely strings that came along with it. Whatever she asked of him, he would do for her.
Christopher had a unique bond with his mother from the perspective of, this is my mom. If she's upset, I'm going to protect my mom. This is my mom, and there are no limits to what I would do for her.
We were told that Becky would supply Christopher with, prescription drugs, hydrocodone, Oxycontin, different drugs like that.
Now, is that something that a mother should do for her son? No.
Until we started taking a lot of Xanax. He loves Xanax. And whenever he'd get on Xanax, I really couldn't do anything with him.
Drug addicts will do amazing things for drugs. I'm pretty sure she took advantage of his mind not being clear.
At this point, I believe that Christopher is so dependent and in love with his mother that he would kill for her.
She's got him. She is manipulating her son to see if he can kill Kay Parsons. I need for you to do this one thing. Here's some Xanax. When they brought them in for questioning,
You got any idea on Chris?
they really didn't get very far with Christopher. They started talking to him, they basically say, hey, you're lying to me.
Everything's not happening the way you said it happened, so I want you to really think long and hard.
And basically, you just called me a liar. And one of my friends died, and then my mother gets shot the next day. I want to speak to a lawyer right now.
I'm sure that investigator said, oh, wow. That's the worst thing that can happen for them because they don't have the defendant locked down to anything.
While Becky was the opposite. We sit her down, we read her rights, and Becky just starts talking.
I messed up because I made Christopher think that I wanted him to do something that was horrible when I didn't want him to hurt anybody, and I made him think that I did, and he was convinced that he was helping me.
What I found so fascinating was how quickly this loving mother turns on him. I mean, she throws him to the wolves so quickly.
Becky went on to tell us that early that morning, she went to Christopher's house, picked him up, brought him back over to her house, where Christopher went upstairs and hid in a spare bedroom. He hangs out up there until Becky leaves with all the kids and Kay leaves her house to take their son to school.
He was outside in our backyard when I left. Well, I don't know where he went. I don't know if he stayed in our backyard until we all left or if he went over there. But I still thought that he would change his mind. And I told him, I was like, Christopher, just stay here and I'll be back in a little while. And he said he was just gonna do what he had to do. I said, you don't have to do anything.
That seals the deal. He's in the backyard as she's leaving. He's not going back there to play volleyball or jump on the trampoline.
When they all leave, he jumps the fence and goes over to 229 to Kay's house.
And Christopher then proceeds to break into Kay Parsons' home and assault and murder Kay Parsons.
It was an implied reason he was going to go to Kay's house because he was going in his mind to do whatever it took to make me happy. And if that meant hurting her, then he probably would do that too. But at the same time, I didn't think that he would because he's so sweet. And that's the reason why he would do anything to make me happy.
You know, it's just Rebecca Sears trying to do whatever Rebecca Sears thinks she needs to do to help Rebecca Sears. And if it means sacrificing her son, no hesitation whatsoever.
She knew exactly what he was planning to do, and she had told him to make sure to stage the burglary in her house.
Christopher then leaves back out the back door, goes back to his mom's house, stages a burglary there, runs out the front door, and he runs through a path in the woods.
He's got a backpack with a spare pair of clothes. I mean, that's how orchestrated it was, that he had a backup pair of clothes. And Becky then gets a call from him where he is. She picks him up.
Could you see blood on his clothes and stuff?
I didn't see any blood on his clothes, but he had blood on his, I think he had blood on his face, and I asked him what. And I said, Christopher, please tell me that she is okay. Please tell me that you did not do this. He said, I beat the out of her.
That was one of the most narcissistic women I've ever seen. Becky Sears is the mastermind behind this whole plot. She just suckered her son in. She plied him, you know, with material things. She plied him with drugs. She knew how much he loved her and knew that he would do anything for her.
Here she was kind of pulling his strings like a puppet master, and he was just doing her bidding.
And any emotion that she showed, that she was upset for Chris or whatever, seemed completely contrived.
I was so scared for him. I don't know how to protect him. I don't know what to do for him. I don't know.
Then we came to the question of when she got shot outside her business the following evening.
I got the 911. Somebody came out from behind the trees and he shot me.
And she explained to us that her and Christopher had set it up. The police were getting too close to her and her family, so they wanted to try to throw the shade off of them.
He didn't mean to shoot me. He was just going to shoot at me to scare me, for me to say that somebody chased after me wanting money.
And they thought that would make us look somewhere else. And they didn't realize that it just made us look at them harder. Not very bright.
Well, no, stand up. Place your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for murder.
After she was actually arrested for the crime, it finally dawned on me, I had interviewed Becky Sears before. I was covering a story about car insurance. And I just remember rolling up to a gas station and seeing, you know, a beautiful blonde woman.
We pay about $6,000 in car insurance a year, so if there was a way to save any of that money, I would be more than happy.
And this couldn't have been more than 9 months before the murders, and potentially when the affair was already happening. You look at her and she just looks like a normal, sweet mom. But there's so much hiding behind the surface. You had no idea. Nobody could have known.
In the last month, prosecutors have slowly unveiled a plot to kill 41-year-old Kay Parsons. Her next-door neighbor, Rebecca Sears, is being called the mastermind, and her son, Christopher Bowers, the attacker. Both have now been indicted in Parsons' murder.
You know, they had hired two really good attorneys to represent them. I mean, Vic and Jacques Hawk were, you know, two big-time attorneys in town.
It's kind of weird to see brothers representing two different defendants who have conflicting interests in such a major case.
Becky's confession flipped everything upside down and made us diametrically opposed to one another now. It was really clear that I was going to have to go after Becky. They hired my brother and going to have to go after Christopher to do our job.
Earlier this week, the mother and son each pleaded not guilty to charges of burglary, armed robbery, malice murder, and felony murder.
Oh, the kisses. I was in the courtroom, I was filming behind the camera, that interaction where she comes into the courtroom and, you know, looks for Christopher and then blows him a kiss. I just remember thinking how inappropriate it felt.
I don't know how you can look at somebody and tell them you love them right after you just thrown them under the bus. That was a show for everybody else. That wasn't for him.
Prosecutors are seeking the death penalty for both Bowers and Sears, making this the fight of both of their lives.
The stakes are now much higher, so the attention on it immediately exploded.
Everybody that followed this realized that the one that was the most evil in this case wasn't Christopher, it was Becky. And she realized that she had a real significant chance of getting the death penalty. And that's when she started doing whatever she could to avoid that.
And now death penalty is on the table. You know things are about to take a turn and get even uglier. There were 2 letters that we were able to get from the courthouse. Both of them are from Becky to Christopher. This one says, "Hey baby, how are you doing? Not too good, I'm sure. I wouldn't blame you if you hated me. I know I let you down. I let all of you down. It was nice to finally get to see you yesterday. I hope you heard me when I said I love you." She's lying to him in these letters, but she's not telling him that. She really threw him under the bus. When the district attorney decided to make this a death penalty case, Becky and Christopher became 2 separate defendants in 2 separate trials. It's gonna be, mother against son.
The state definitely wants to convict Christopher Bowers for what he did. But in order to be able to do that, they need some good, objective, concrete evidence. So what evidence is there against Christopher? They have little or no evidence except Rebecca's statement. No DNA, no blood, no witness, nothing.
Before the case goes to trial, Becky drops another bombshell. She has her attorney contact the district attorney and tells them that she knows where the bloody clothes are, the jewelry that was taken during the burglaries. She told us that they were at her mother's house, in her mother's attic, hidden in a box. So we conducted a search warrant at her mother's house, found the box in the attic.
It had everything. It had all the blood stains from the victim. It would have Christopher's DNA all in it. By turning over all the box of clothes and all the final evidence that completed everything they needed to nail Christopher. And in exchange for that, they took the death penalty off the table for her.
She traded his life to save her life. The relationship between the mother and the son is upside down.
Friday, Rebecca Sears and her son Christopher Bowers pleaded guilty to Kay's murder, closing the case for good.
Are you pleading guilty because you are guilty?
I think it was devastating to Christopher. It was just like, this is my mom. She's doing everything she can to hurt me. I felt so sorry for him. Like he was just, had his life taken by his mom.
How could she, as a mother, do this to her son, do this to another woman's son, do this to her other children?
She was completely diabolical. And by diabolical, if you look it up, it says acting and behaving like the devil.
I wouldn't even use the word mother to describe her.
The fact that her son loved her so much was just a tool that she could use to get what she wanted.
This one woman's, obsession with this man destroyed these two families. I mean, it destroyed a lot of lives.
She lost a lot that day. There's no winners in that game. Everybody lost.
I feel for all the children involved. I feel for Kay's son. I mean, growing up not knowing his mother, not having her there for some big moments in his life. High school graduation, weddings, his children. He doesn't have her in his life because of this affair gone wrong.
The call came in just after dawn, when the fog was still clinging to the fields like a held breath, when the radio crackled and a dispatcher's voice cut through the quiet with two words that would echo for decades: body found. A jogger had spotted something unnatural at the edge of a drainage ditch outside a small Ohio town most maps barely bothered to name, a shape that didn't belong among weeds and frost, a stillness that felt wrong even from a distance, and by the time the first cruiser rolled up, headlights washing over mud and dead leaves, it was already clear this would not be a clean story, not a simple one, not something the town could fold away and forget. The woman lay half-turned, jacket torn, one shoe missing, hair matted with blood and damp earth, her eyes closed as if she were sleeping through a nightmare she would never wake from, and in that moment the ground beneath this place shifted, quietly, permanently. The way it does when a cold case is born. She was young, mid-20s, known by nearly everyone who saw her face once the news broke, a waitress at a local diner, a daughter who called home every Sunday, a familiar figure behind the counter pouring coffee for farmers and truckers before sunrise. And now she was reduced to evidence markers and photographs snapped under harsh light, to gloved hands turning pockets inside out, to a body bag zipped closed while the fog finally lifted and revealed a line of neighbors standing back from the tape, whispering, stunned, afraid to meet each other's eyes. This wasn't Cleveland or Columbus, this was a place where doors stayed unlocked, where strangers stood out, where a violent death hit like a punch to the chest, and as rumors began to ripple through kitchens and break rooms, one word started to surface again and again, heavy with fear: who? The initial investigation moved fast, as these things often do when the wound is fresh and the pressure is high. Detectives canvassed the area, knocked on doors, asked the same questions until their voices went hoarse. Had anyone heard screaming, seen a car pulled over late at night, noticed a man lurking where he didn't belong? They collected fibers, photographed tire impressions already blurring at the edges, bagged cigarette butts and a broken watch found yards away, items that felt important because they had to be important, because there needed to be something to hold on to. The autopsy revealed blunt force trauma, signs of a struggle, no immediate identification of the weapon, no neat narrative to follow, and as the report circulated, the town held its breath, waiting for the arrest that never came. Her last known hours became a timeline sketched and erased again and again on whiteboards and notepads. She'd finished a late shift, clocked out, chatted with a coworker in the parking lot under flickering lights, said she was heading home, a 10-minute drive along a dark stretch of road bordered by fields and trees, a route she'd taken 100 times without incident. Somewhere between the diner and her front door, she vanished, swallowed by a night that left no clear footprints, no witnesses willing or able to speak with certainty, only gaps filled by speculation. A truck seen idling. A scream mistaken for laughter. A neighbor who thought they heard a car door slam around midnight. Each detail felt sharp at first, then dulled under scrutiny, leaving investigators with the growing sense that the truth was slipping through their fingers. As days turned into weeks, the case cooled just enough for dread to settle in. Candlelight vigils lit the town square, faces glowing and tear-streaked as prayers were whispered into the cold air, and behind those prayers was an unspoken fear that the killer was still there, shopping at the same grocery store, pumping gas at the same station. blending into the rhythm of small-town life. Tips flooded in, some earnest, some cruel, some fueled by grudges and old rumors, and detectives chased them all, driving down gravel roads at midnight, interviewing ex-boyfriends, co-workers, men with records and men with none. Anyone who fit the shifting profile of a suspect that never quite solidified. There were moments when it seemed close, when a lead flared bright enough to make hearts race. A man questioned after a bar fight. A vehicle matching a vague description. A lab result that hinted at a possible connection. Each time, hope surged, only to collapse under the weight of alibis, inconclusive tests, evidence that refused to line up. The file grew thicker, the boxes heavier, the questions more corrosive, and quietly, almost imperceptibly, the case slipped into a category no investigator ever wants to admit exists until it's too late: cold case. Years passed, then more years, and the town changed in subtle ways. The diner replaced its flickering lights. New families moved in, unaware of the name that still tightened older residents' throats. The victims' parents aged visibly, their faces etched by a grief that never found release, and every anniversary brought a fresh wave of pain, fresh headlines that asked the same question in different words, fresh promises from law enforcement that the case had not been forgotten. But memory is a fragile thing, and as witnesses moved away or died, as evidence degraded in storage, the odds tilted further toward silence. Inside the police department, the boxes remained, stacked and labeled, a physical reminder of unfinished business. Detectives came and went, some glancing at the file with a mixture of curiosity and resignation, others diving in during quiet hours, hoping fresh eyes might catch what others had missed. They traced old leads, re-interviewed reluctant witnesses, tried to reconstruct a night that refused to be reconstructed, and every so often, someone would say it out loud, half in frustration, half in fear, maybe this one will never be solved. Then time did what time always does, and the world changed around the case. Forensics evolved. DNA analysis advanced from a fledgling tool into a powerful weapon, capable of pulling identities from the smallest biological traces. What once seemed useless became precious. What once tested negative could be tested again with methods no one in 1987 could have imagined, and slowly, quietly, the idea began to take hold that the answers might not be lost forever, just waiting for the right moment to be heard. The evidence, long sealed, was reopened with care, with a reverence born of knowing how much rode on what lay inside. Swabs taken decades earlier, fibers catalogued and forgotten, items handled by countless gloved hands were sent back to the lab, this time under a new light, a more exacting scrutiny. Technicians worked methodically, aware that any result, even a partial one, could shift the ground once again, could turn a cold case into something warmer, more dangerous, more real. When the first indications came back, they were cautious, qualified, the kind of results that make professionals sit up a little straighter without letting hope show on their faces. A profile, incomplete but promising. A genetic fingerprint where none had existed before. It wasn't a name yet, not even close, but it was something, a whisper from the past that suggested the silence might finally break, and as word filtered through the department, there was a sense of anticipation edged with dread, because reopening old wounds means risking old failures. And no one wanted to be wrong again. Outside, the town carried on, unaware that the ground beneath it was about to shift for a second time. Children played where patrol cars once idled. New residents drove roads without knowing their history. But in quiet rooms filled with fluorescent light and the hum of machines, the past was being pulled forward, molecule by molecule, toward a confrontation it had avoided for nearly 40 years, and as the pieces began to align, one truth loomed larger with every passing day. Whatever happened on that dark Ohio road in 1987 was not finished with this place, and the reckoning, delayed but relentless, was finally on its way. The lab didn't speak in certainties at first, only in probabilities and margins, in careful language designed to avoid false hope, but even that was enough to change the temperature of the room. A partial genetic profile meant there had been contact, meant the killer had left something behind whether he knew it or not, and that single fact cracked open a door investigators had been pushing against for years. The evidence had been there all along, silent, patient, waiting for technology to catch up, and now it was whispering again, just loud enough to be heard over the hum of machines and the low voices of technicians who understood the weight of what they were handling. The profile was run through state databases first, then federal ones, the familiar channels that had yielded nothing so many times before, and when those searches came back empty, the disappointment was sharp but brief. This was a different era now, a different approach, and the conversation shifted quickly towards something that would have sounded like science fiction in 1987, genetic genealogy. The idea that a killer could be found not by his own name but by the echo of his DNA in distant relatives felt both elegant and invasive, a powerful tool that raised as many ethical questions as it promised answers, and after months of deliberation, approvals, and quiet debate, the decision was made to move forward. Data was uploaded, stripped of identifiers, reduced to sequences and markers that meant nothing to the casual observer but everything to those trained to read them. Public genealogy databases were searched for partial matches, not hits but hints, faint alignments that suggested shared ancestry, a distant cousin here, a third cousin there, people who had mailed off saliva samples out of curiosity or a desire to trace family roots, unaware they might one day be connected to a murder investigation decades old. Each match widened the web, creating branches and intersections that investigators mapped painstakingly, names and dates stretching backward and outward, family trees growing dense with possibilities. This was slow work, the kind that demanded patience and a tolerance for uncertainty. Analysts cross-referenced census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries, anything that could anchor the genetic data to real lives and real places. Patterns began to emerge, clusters of relatives concentrated in certain counties, certain states, and gradually, the focus narrowed, not to a single person but to a family line that traced back to Ohio in the mid-20th century. It was progress measured in inches, not miles, but for a case that had gone nowhere for so long, it felt monumental. As the net tightened, investigators began overlaying the family tree with the known facts of the case. Who would have been in their 20s or 30s in 1987? Who lived within driving distance of the crime scene? Who had reason to be on that stretch of road late at night? The list shrank, names crossed out as quickly as they were added, and with each elimination, the sense of inevitability grew. Somewhere in this web was the person who had taken a life and then walked away, blending into the background of ordinary existence, raising families, holding jobs, aging quietly while the victim's family remained frozen in grief. One name, at first unremarkable, began to stand out through a convergence of details too sharp to ignore. He had lived nearby in the late 80s. He worked irregular hours that would have placed him on the road at night. He had a minor criminal record, nothing violent enough to draw attention at the time, but enough to suggest a comfort with risk. There was no smoking gun yet, no confession, no definitive proof, just a growing sense that this was the direction the past wanted to be pulled. Surveillance followed, discreet and methodical, because even after all these years, the rules still applied. Investigators watched as he went about his routine, a man in his 60s now, hair graying, movements slower, unremarkable in the way that so many people are unremarkable. He shopped for groceries, chatted with neighbors, waved at passers-by, and in those moments, the contrast was jarring, the idea that someone who looked so ordinary could be tied to something so monstrous. But history had taught them not to trust appearances. The opportunity came in the form of discarded trash, a coffee cup tossed into a bin outside a gas station, a napkin smeared with lipstick from someone else entirely, a cigarette but crushed under a shoe. Items that carried DNA, items that could be collected without confrontation, without tipping a hand that had taken decades to position correctly. The samples were rushed to the lab, processed with a care bordering on reverence, because this was the moment everything hinged on, the moment where years of waiting would either crystallize into truth or dissolve back into uncertainty. When the results came in, there was no fanfare, no dramatic announcement, just a quiet confirmation that rippled through the team like an electric current. The DNA from the discarded items matched the profile pulled from the evidence in 1987. Not partially. Not ambiguously. It was a match strong enough to make the room feel smaller, the air heavier, the past suddenly very close. The killer, long imagined and never seen, now had a face, a name, a place in the present, and with that knowledge came a wave of emotions no one had fully prepared for. The arrest was planned with precision, because even after all this time, the stakes were high. Officers approached his home in daylight, calm and controlled, aware that neighbors would watch, that questions would spread faster than facts. He answered the door himself, confusion flickering across his face as he was told why they were there, what they believed, what the evidence now showed. There was no dramatic outburst, no immediate confession, just a tightening of the jaw, a long pause that seemed to stretch into minutes, and then a resignation that spoke louder than words. News of the arrest hit the town like a delayed shockwave. Headlines blared the phrase everyone had stopped expecting to see attached to this case: cold case breakthrough. Social media lit up with disbelief, relief, anger, and a strange sense of disorientation as people tried to reconcile the passage of time with the suddenness of resolution. For the victim's family, the call came quietly, respectfully, detectives explaining what had happened, what the evidence showed, what would come next, and in that moment, decades of waiting collapsed into a single, overwhelming surge of emotion. But even with a suspect in custody, the story was far from simple. The man denied involvement at first, then shifted his account, offering fragments that contradicted each other, memories that seemed selectively intact. Interviews stretched on, late into the night, investigators pressing gently but firmly, laying out timelines, locations, forensic facts that left less and less room to maneuver. Still, the full truth remained elusive, tangled in the erosion of memory and the human capacity for self-deception. The community grappled with the revelation in its own way. People combed through old photographs, wondered how close they had come without knowing it, replayed mundane interactions now tinged with suspicion. Some felt relief that the danger was finally named, contained. Others felt a renewed anger that it had taken so long, that justice had been delayed by limitations no one could control. The phrase modern forensics became a kind of shorthand for both hope and regret, a reminder of what had been impossible once and what might still be possible now. In the courtroom, the evidence told a story the defendant could not easily escape. The DNA, the circumstantial connections, the patterns that aligned too neatly to dismiss as coincidence. Prosecutors spoke of a night in 1987 when a chance encounter turned violent, when a woman's routine was interrupted by someone who saw an opportunity and took it, leaving chaos in his wake. The defense tried to sow doubt, to question the reliability of decades-old evidence and cutting-edge techniques, but the weight of the facts pressed in from all sides. As the trial unfolded, one thing became increasingly clear: solving the case did not erase its impact. The years lost could not be returned. The fear that had reshaped the town lingered in subtle ways, in the stories parents told their children, in the caution that had become instinct. Closure, a word often used too lightly, proved to be complex and uneven, arriving in pieces rather than all at once. And beneath it all, a quieter realization settled in, one that would outlast the headlines and the verdicts. This case had been silent for a long time, but it had never truly gone away. It had waited, patient and unresolved, for science to catch up, for someone to look again with new eyes. In doing so, it exposed both the fragility and the persistence of justice, the way truth can hide in plain sight, and the unsettling knowledge that even the longest shadows can be pulled into the light, given enough time and the will to keep asking questions no matter how many years pass. The courtroom felt smaller than anyone expected, its wooden benches polished by decades of restless hands, its walls holding the low hum of anticipation that came whenever a story this old finally demanded an ending. People lined up before dawn, some driven by grief, some by curiosity, some by a need to witness history being corrected, and as the defendant was led in, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on a point just beyond the floor, the air tightened. This was the face attached to the whispers, the silhouette that had haunted newspaper clippings and anniversary specials, and yet there was nothing cinematic about him, nothing that matched the monstrous image built over years of fear. That disconnect alone sent a shiver through the room. Prosecutors opened with restraint, knowing they didn't need theatrics. They spoke of 1987 not as nostalgia but as a wound, a night frozen in time, a sequence of ordinary moments that collapsed into violence without warning. They walked the jury through the final hours of the victim's life, her shift at the diner, the routine goodbyes, the familiar drive, and then the rupture, the sudden presence of someone who should not have been there. Each detail landed with deliberate weight, the words measured, the cadence steady, as if daring anyone to look away from the consequences of that night. The defense countered with doubt, with the passage of time as their shield. Memories fade, they argued. Evidence degrades. Science evolves, and what seems certain now might have been invisible then for a reason. They spoke of the dangers of relying on modern techniques to interpret old traces, of the possibility that contamination or coincidence could masquerade as certainty. It was a familiar strategy, one that leaned heavily on the discomfort people feel when the past is dragged into the present and asked to answer questions it was never meant to face. Witnesses took the stand, some with voices still steady, others trembling as they revisited moments they had tried for years to bury. A former co-worker described the last time she saw the victim alive, the casual wave, the offhand comment about being tired, the way nothing about that night seemed unusual until it was all anyone could talk about. An investigator from the original task force spoke next, his hair now white, his posture stiff with age, explaining the limitations they had faced, the leads that went nowhere, the frustration of knowing the killer was out there but lacking the tools to prove it. Then came the forensic experts, the architects of the case's revival. They spoke in precise language, translating complex processes into narratives the jury could follow, explaining how DNA, once too fragmented to analyze, could now be amplified, compared, contextualized. Charts appeared on screens, lines intersecting, probabilities narrowing, and as the explanation unfolded, the sense of inevitability returned. This was not guesswork. This was accumulation, layers of data converging on a single conclusion that resisted being shaken. The defendant watched quietly, expression unreadable, hands clasped tightly in his lap. When his attorney whispered, he nodded almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging a truth he had rehearsed in private for years. There were moments when his eyes flicked toward the gallery, toward faces that searched his for recognition, for remorse, for any sign that he understood the magnitude of what was happening. Mostly, they found nothing, and that absence spoke louder than anger ever could. Outside the courthouse, the town gathered in fragments. Reporters clustered near the steps, microphones poised, their questions sharp and relentless. Old neighbors recognized each other in the crowd, exchanging looks that carried decades of shared unease. Some remembered the night vividly, others only as a story told by parents or grandparents, but all felt the same strange pull, the sense that the ground beneath them was finally settling after years of quiet instability. As testimony continued, new layers emerged, details that had never made it into early reports. A witness who had once been dismissed as unreliable was revisited, her account reframed by context no one had possessed at the time. She spoke of a vehicle parked oddly along the road, of a man pacing, agitated, glancing toward the darkness as if waiting for something. Back then, it had seemed insignificant, another thread that led nowhere. Now, aligned with the defendant's movements, it took on a sharper edge, a piece of the puzzle snapping into place with an audible click. The prosecution introduced evidence of opportunity, not as a single smoking gun but as a pattern. Work records placing the defendant nearby. Financial stress that coincided with the period. A history of volatile behavior that had been minimized, excused, forgotten. None of it proved murder on its own, but together, it painted a picture that was difficult to ignore, a portrait of someone capable of crossing a line and then retreating into the anonymity of time. The defense pushed back hard, questioning the ethics of genetic genealogy, hinting at overreach, at a slippery slope where privacy eroded under the banner of justice. It was an argument that resonated beyond the room, tapping into broader fears about surveillance and consent, and for a moment, the case felt larger than itself, a test of how far society was willing to go to resolve its oldest wounds. The judge listened carefully, ruling narrowly, allowing the evidence to stand, and with each decision, the direction of the trial became clearer. Midway through the proceedings, the victim's family took their seats in the front row. They had avoided the spotlight for years, choosing quiet remembrance over public anguish, but now they were here, faces set with a resolve forged by decades of waiting. When photographs were displayed, images from before the crime, the room seemed to inhale collectively. She smiled out from the screen, alive in a way the evidence never could capture, and for a brief moment, the abstraction of the case dissolved into something painfully human. The defendant was offered the chance to speak, to tell his story, to deny or explain or deflect. He did, haltingly, a narrative riddled with gaps and contradictions. He claimed coincidence, bad luck, the unfortunate overlap of DNA and circumstance. His voice wavered at times, strengthened at others, but it never quite found solid ground. Cross-examination stripped the account down to its bones, exposing the inconsistencies, the convenient lapses in memory, and as the questions piled up, the space for doubt shrank further. Deliberations were tense, the jury sequestered, the town holding its breath yet again. Hours stretched into days, speculation filling the void, old anxieties resurfacing. People wondered what a verdict would mean, whether guilt or innocence could truly resolve something so old, so deeply embedded in the community's identity. The phrase cold case took on a different tone now, less a marker of failure and more a reminder of endurance, of the long arc that justice sometimes traces. When the jury returned, the room fell silent in a way that felt absolute. The foreperson stood, hands shaking slightly, and read the verdict, each word measured, irreversible. Guilty. The sound seemed to reverberate, not as a shout but as a release, a pressure finally easing after years of constriction. Some cried openly. Others stared straight ahead, absorbing the weight of it in their own way. Sentencing followed, the judge speaking of accountability, of the harm that ripples outward from a single act of violence, touching generations. The defendant was led away, his future now defined by the past he had tried to outrun. There was no triumph in the room, no sense of victory, only a sober acknowledgement that something long unresolved had finally been named. Yet even as the legal process reached its conclusion, questions lingered, hovering at the edges of certainty. Why that night? Why that place? Whether there were moments when it could have been stopped, paths not taken, choices unmade. These were questions no verdict could answer, mysteries that remained folded into the fabric of the story, resistant to closure. As people filtered out of the courthouse, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the steps. Conversations were hushed, reflective. The town would carry this day forward, adding it to the timeline that began with a foggy morning in 1987. The case was no longer unsolved, but its imprint endured, a reminder that time does not erase violence, it only delays the reckoning. And somewhere between relief and sorrow, a deeper realization took hold. This wasn't just about one man identified through modern forensics. It was about patience, about the stubborn refusal of truth to stay buried, about the way the past can wait, quietly, until the present is ready to face it. The cold case had cracked open at last, but what spilled out was not just answers, it was the enduring echo of a life cut short and a community forever changed. The verdict did not end the story, it changed its gravity. What followed was not relief so much as a long exhale, the kind that leaves the chest aching afterward, because for a town that had lived with uncertainty for nearly 4 decades, certainty itself felt foreign. In the days after the trial, conversations slowed, voices dropped, and people spoke less about the defendant and more about the night itself, as if now that a name had been attached, the past demanded to be replayed one last time, frame by frame, without interruption. Reporters returned to the diner where it had all begun, the linoleum replaced, the counter polished, but the layout unmistakably the same. They filmed empty booths and steaming coffee mugs, searching for atmosphere, while longtime staff watched from a distance, arms crossed, remembering a younger version of themselves moving through this space, laughing, complaining. Unaware that one ordinary shift would become a permanent timestamp in local history. The camera lights clicked off, but the memory stayed on, bright and unforgiving. The victim's family retreated again from public view, this time not because the case was unsolved, but because grief had shifted shape. Justice, when it finally arrives, does not erase loss, it sharpens it, clarifies it, strips away the hope that something else might change. They sorted through old belongings with a different weight now, letters and photographs no longer suspended between past and future but anchored firmly in what had been taken. Friends noticed how their smiles came more slowly, how silence stretched longer in conversations, how closure proved to be a word that fit poorly around the edges of reality. Within law enforcement, the case became a point of quiet reckoning. Younger detectives studied the files with a kind of reverence, not just for what had been solved, but for what had been endured. The older ones spoke less, haunted by memories of leads that slipped through fingers, by nights spent staring at maps and timelines that refused to align. There was pride, yes, in the outcome, but also humility, an acknowledgement of limits, of how much depended on timing, funding, technology, and sheer persistence. Training seminars referenced the case now, not by name but by implication. Slides displayed charts showing the evolution of forensic science, from blood typing to DNA profiling to genetic genealogy. Instructors spoke about preservation, about never discarding evidence that seemed useless today, because tomorrow had a way of changing the rules. The Ohio 1987 case became a quiet warning and a promise at the same time: failure is not always final, and patience can be a form of justice. The defendant, meanwhile, settled into the slow machinery of incarceration. Appeals were discussed, motions filed, the language of the law continuing its relentless march, but the public attention faded quickly. Without mystery, there was less appetite. Without unanswered questions, the headlines lost their urgency. He became another name in the system, another inmate number, his notoriety dissolving into routine, while the crime he committed remained vivid everywhere else. For the town, the realization crept in gradually that safety had not been restored by the verdict, it had simply been redefined. The killer had not arrived from somewhere else and vanished again. He had lived among them. He had shared their roads, their stores, their ordinary spaces. That knowledge lingered like an aftertaste, subtle but persistent, reshaping how people understood their own history. Evil had not been an external force, it had been local, familiar, unnoticed. Memorials took on new meaning. The annual vigil, once an act of hope, became an act of remembrance. Candles flickered in the same square, but the speeches changed tone, focusing less on finding answers and more on honoring a life that had been reduced too often to the manner of her death. Her name was spoken more frequently now, detached from the word victim, attached instead to stories, to laughter, to who she had been before that night claimed her place in the archives. The road where her body had been found saw little change. Cars still passed at night, headlights sweeping over the ditch, drivers unaware or only vaguely aware of what had happened there. A small, unofficial marker appeared for a time, flowers and a laminated photograph, then disappeared again, reclaimed by weather or removal. The land did not remember, but the people did, and that disconnect, between place and memory, underscored how fragile commemoration could be. In interviews, prosecutors spoke about restraint, about resisting the urge to declare victory. They emphasized that the case had not been solved by a single breakthrough but by accumulation, by years of evidence preserved, by scientists and analysts whose names would never appear in headlines. It was a corrective to the myth of sudden revelation, a reminder that justice often moves not in leaps but in increments, invisible until it isn't. Critics, too, found their voices. Civil liberties advocates questioned the expanding reach of genetic databases, warning that today's cold case heroics could become tomorrow's surveillance overreach. Town halls filled with uneasy debates, residents torn between gratitude for resolution and discomfort with the methods that made it possible. The case became a reference point in arguments far beyond Ohio, cited in articles and panels as an example of both promise and peril. Yet for those closest to the story, the abstract debates felt distant. What mattered was that a question that had echoed for decades now had an answer, even if that answer brought little comfort. The night of the murder remained as violent and senseless as ever, the difference was that it no longer floated untethered in the past. It had been pinned to a person, a sequence of actions, a chain of responsibility that could be named aloud. Old witnesses, some frail, some sharp despite their years, were contacted again, this time not for information but for reflection. Many expressed a strange relief, not because they had been right or vindicated, but because the burden of uncertainty had lifted. Others admitted regret, replaying moments when they might have spoken more clearly, pushed harder, trusted their instincts. The passage of time had softened some edges, sharpened others, but it had not erased the sense that history could have turned out differently. The media cycle moved on, as it always does, but the case lingered in quieter spaces. In classrooms, teachers used it to discuss science and ethics. In living rooms, parents referenced it in conversations about caution and trust. In police stations, it sat as a reminder that the unsolved boxes on the shelves were not dead weight, they were dormant, waiting. At night, when the town settled into its familiar rhythms, there were moments when the silence felt heavier than before. Not because the danger was unknown, but because it had been known all along without being recognized. That awareness altered the texture of memory, turning nostalgia brittle, forcing a re-evaluation of the past that had once seemed simpler. The victim's name appeared again in print months later, not tied to the trial but to a scholarship established in her memory, a small attempt to transform loss into something forward-looking. The announcement was modest, almost understated, but it resonated deeply, a counterpoint to the violence that had defined her public legacy. It was a reminder that remembrance could be active, not just reflective. And still, beneath every conversation, every article, every lesson drawn from the case, the same unease persisted. If this had taken nearly 40 years to solve, how many others waited in silence? How many truths were stalled behind technological limits, bureaucratic inertia, simple human error? The Ohio 1987 cold case was no longer alone, it had become a symbol, a signal flare illuminating both what was possible and what remained unresolved. The story, now stripped of mystery but heavy with consequence, settled into the collective consciousness of the town. It was told more quietly, with fewer sharp edges, but it was not forgotten. It lived on in the way people looked twice at the familiar, in the way they understood that the ordinary could fracture without warning, in the awareness that time, while powerful, was not a guarantee of forgetting. And as the years continued their steady march forward, one truth endured, unshaken by verdicts or advancements. The past does not disappear when it is explained. It lingers, reshaped but intact, a shadow cast long across the present, reminding everyone who walks beneath it that some nights never truly end, they only wait, patient and unresolved, until the light finally catches up. Time did not close the book, it turned the page. After the trial, after the headlines thinned and the cameras packed away, the case entered a quieter phase, one defined not by spectacle but by consequence. Files were archived again, this time with finality, yet detectives found themselves returning to them, drawn by habit or by the lingering need to understand every contour of what had happened. Solving the case had answered who, but it left the deeper questions intact, the ones that never appear on charging documents yet refuse to fade. In the weeks that followed, investigators reconstructed the night once more, not to prove guilt, but to confront the anatomy of chance. The weather reports were pulled, noting the fog, the temperature, the way sound would have carried or been swallowed. Traffic patterns were studied, not for suspects now, but for absence, for the empty stretches where a scream might dissolve into nothing. It was an exercise in restraint, in acknowledging that understanding does not always bring comfort, but for those who had carried the case for years, it was necessary, a way to put the past in its place without pretending it no longer mattered. The defendant's history was examined with a new intensity, every overlooked detail now scrutinized through the lens of inevitability. Old acquaintances were contacted, their memories suddenly sharpened by the knowledge of what he had done. Stories emerged of volatile arguments, of simmering anger that flared without warning, of moments that once seemed trivial but now glowed with a faint, unsettling significance. None of it altered the verdict, but it filled in the negative space, revealing how easily warning signs could be misread or dismissed when violence remained hypothetical. For the victim's family, the rhythm of life shifted again, uneven and unpredictable. There were days when the knowledge of accountability felt grounding, a solid thing to stand on after years of uncertainty. There were others when it felt like a fresh weight, pressing down with the realization that nothing more would come, no further revelations to soften the loss. Birthdays and holidays took on a sharper edge, the absence now framed not by mystery but by finality, a difference subtle yet profound. Community leaders convened meetings to discuss what the case meant going forward. Not in abstract terms, but in policies and procedures, in how evidence was stored, how tips were logged, how unsolved cases were revisited. The police chief spoke candidly about past limitations, about the importance of humility in the face of evolving science. It was not an apology, but it was close, a recognition that justice is a moving target, and missing it once does not absolve the responsibility to keep aiming. Across the state, other departments took notice. Cold case units saw renewed interest, funding requests bolstered by the Ohio example, the argument made tangible, patience pays dividends. Boxes long untouched were reopened, evidence re-examined, families contacted with cautious optimism. Not every case yielded results, not every story bent toward resolution, but the ripple effect was undeniable. One breakthrough had cracked a door for many others. The media framed it as a triumph of modern forensics, and in many ways it was, but the narrative was incomplete without the quieter truth. Technology did not act alone. It required people willing to preserve, to revisit, to resist the temptation to declare defeat. It required someone to believe that the past still had something to say, and that listening was worth the discomfort it might bring. That belief, fragile yet persistent, proved as crucial as any algorithm. Ethical debates intensified as the case circulated through academic journals and conference panels. Genetic genealogy was dissected, praised for its power, questioned for its reach. Experts argued over consent, over the balance between individual privacy and collective safety, over where lines should be drawn and who should draw them. The Ohio case became a touchstone, cited as evidence that the benefits were real, the stakes undeniable. It forced a reckoning that extended far beyond one crime, one town, one victim. Meanwhile, the town itself settled into a new normal, one that acknowledged the past without being consumed by it. Younger residents learned the story not as a warning whispered in fear, but as history, something that had happened before they were born yet shaped the place they lived. Older residents found themselves telling it differently now, less speculation, more certainty, though the emotional weight remained unchanged. The story had matured, hardened by truth. There were moments of unexpected connection. Former investigators received letters from families of other victims, thanking them for refusing to let a case die, for demonstrating that time did not have to be an enemy. Some letters were brief, others sprawling, each carrying a mixture of hope and grief that felt achingly familiar. It reminded them that their work existed in a network of stories, each one pressing against the next, each one waiting for its turn. The legal aftermath continued in parallel, appeals filed and denied, the slow grind of the system asserting itself. Each motion briefly resurfaced the case, a flicker of attention before it sank back into quiet. For most, these developments registered as footnotes, technicalities that did not alter the core truth. The conviction stood, firm and unyielding, a marker placed at the end of a long road. In classrooms and labs, students studied the case as a model, tracing the arc from initial investigation to cold storage to revival. They learned about the fragility of evidence, about the importance of chain of custody, about how assumptions can calcify into blind spots. Instructors emphasized not just the science, but the mindset required to revisit failure without defensiveness, to accept that progress often comes from admitting what was once impossible. The victim's name appeared again in a different context, attached to a community initiative aimed at supporting unsolved cases. Volunteers organized fundraisers, awareness campaigns, quiet acts of advocacy that kept other stories from fading entirely. It was a way of extending her legacy beyond the circumstances of her death, of transforming a singular tragedy into a source of collective resolve. At night, the roads remained the same, dark and empty in places, but the way people drove them had changed. There was no longer the same undercurrent of dread, but there was a heightened awareness, a sense that familiarity did not equal safety, that vigilance was not paranoia but respect for the lessons of history. The town had learned, slowly and painfully, that danger does not announce itself. As the years continued to accumulate beyond the verdict, the case assumed a different shape in memory. It was no longer a question mark, no longer an open wound, but a scar, visible and instructive. It reminded those who carried it that justice could be delayed without being denied, that truth could survive neglect and indifference if it was preserved with care. Yet even as the story settled, it resisted closure in the conventional sense. There were no neat moral lessons, no clear villains beyond the one now named and confined. What remained was complexity, the understanding that human systems are imperfect, that progress is uneven, that waiting is often part of the price paid by those who seek answers. The Ohio 1987 cold case had crossed a threshold, transformed from an emblem of failure into a testament of persistence. It stood as proof that the past could be revisited without being rewritten, that accountability could arrive long after the moment it was needed most. And in that transformation lay both comfort and unease, because if this story could be reopened and resolved, then so could countless others, each one carrying its own weight, its own demands. In the end, the case did not fade into obscurity. It became part of a larger conversation about time, memory, and responsibility. It lingered in the margins of other investigations, in the quiet determination of detectives who refused to accept silence as an answer. It reminded everyone who encountered it that justice is not a single act, but a sustained effort, one that may stretch across decades without losing its claim on the present. And somewhere in that long stretch of years, between the night of violence and the moment of reckoning, a simple truth emerged, stark and unyielding. The past is not done with us when we ignore it. It waits. And when the tools finally exist to hear it speak, it demands not celebration, but attention, patience, and the courage to listen until the very end. As the case receded from headlines, its influence deepened in quieter, less visible ways, threading itself into routines and decisions that would never be publicly credited to a single murder solved too late. Detectives who had once viewed cold cases as static archives began to treat them as living documents, their margins open for new annotations, their conclusions provisional rather than final. The Ohio file became a reference point not because it was exceptional in its violence, but because it demonstrated how endurance could outlast failure, how attention could be renewed without apology. In evidence rooms, the lesson translated into discipline. Boxes were relabeled, inventories updated, protocols revised with an almost obsessive care. Items once considered peripheral were cataloged anew, preserved against the possibility that tomorrow's science would render today's assumptions obsolete. It was a shift in mindset as much as method, a recognition that evidence was not inert, that its value could change with context, and that neglect was itself a decision with consequences measured in years. The families of other unsolved victims watched closely, their reactions a mixture of guarded hope and learned restraint. For some, the Ohio case felt like a door cracking open, proof that the long wait might not be endless. For others, it stirred a different kind of pain, reopening wounds they had learned to live with by convincing themselves that answers were no longer possible. Support groups saw new faces, conversations drifting inevitably toward advances in DNA, toward questions of whether preserved samples existed, whether anyone still cared enough to look again. Lawmakers took notice as well, though their interest was filtered through budgets and public pressure. Funding for forensic labs became easier to justify, no longer an abstract investment but a tangible path to resolution. Bills were proposed to standardize evidence retention, to ensure that cases did not quietly expire due to misplaced boxes or outdated policies. Not all passed, not all survived committee rooms and political compromise, but the conversation itself marked a shift, an acknowledgement that justice delayed by infrastructure was still justice denied. Within the scientific community, the case became a study in both triumph and caution. Researchers cited it as validation of genetic genealogy's potential, while also emphasizing its limitations, the margins of error that demanded humility. They spoke of false leads, of the temptation to see patterns where none existed, of the responsibility to corroborate genetic findings with traditional investigative work. The Ohio case, they argued, succeeded not because of a single technique, but because multiple disciplines converged without allowing one to dominate unchecked. The defendant's appeals continued quietly, procedural rather than substantive, arguments focused on process rather than innocence. Each filing was met with the same steady response, denials issued without commentary, reinforcing the sense that the legal chapter had truly closed. For the victim's family, these moments were brief disruptions, reminders that finality in law did not always align with finality in emotion. Still, the outcome held, firm enough to withstand the pressure of revision. Anniversaries took on a new cadence. The date of the murder remained heavy, but the date of the arrest began to matter too, marking a different kind of milestone. Local papers ran smaller pieces now, reflective rather than urgent, interviews framed by hindsight instead of speculation. The language shifted subtly, moving away from shock and toward contemplation, as if the community had agreed, implicitly, to handle the story with a gentler touch. In schools, the case found its way into curricula not as a cautionary tale alone, but as a lens through which to discuss ethics, science, and the passage of time. Students debated privacy versus public good, the morality of using consumer DNA data to solve crimes, the responsibility of institutions to adapt as knowledge evolves. For many, it was their first encounter with the idea that justice could be both precise and imperfect, powerful yet constrained by human decision-making. The victim's memory continued to surface in unexpected places. A mural appeared briefly on the side of a community center, not depicting violence, but a simple portrait drawn from photographs, her expression calm, almost defiant. It sparked conversation, then controversy, then quiet acceptance. Some felt it kept wounds open, others saw it as reclamation, an insistence that she be remembered for more than the way she died. Eventually, weather softened the paint, and the image faded, but the discussion it prompted lingered. Former suspects from the early days of the investigation experienced their own reckoning. Some reached out to detectives, expressing relief that the truth had emerged, that the shadow they had lived under for years had finally lifted. Others remained silent, perhaps unwilling to revisit a period when suspicion had altered their lives in subtle, corrosive ways. The case had touched them too, leaving marks that were never publicly acknowledged. In the town's collective memory, the night of the murder began to separate from the person who committed it. The details of his life receded, replaced by a sharper focus on the fragility of routine, the randomness of harm. People spoke less about him and more about the moment itself, the intersection of chance and intent that had rewritten so many lives. It was a subtle shift, but an important one, redirecting attention away from notoriety and back toward impact. Elsewhere, investigative journalists revisited other long-dormant cases with renewed vigor, inspired by the Ohio outcome. They filed records requests, tracked down retired detectives, pressed departments to explain why certain files remained untouched. Some uncovered negligence, others encountered genuine limitations, but in each instance, the expectation had changed. Silence was no longer an acceptable endpoint, it required justification. The emotional landscape for the victim's family continued to evolve, uneven and deeply personal. There were moments of peace, when the knowledge that the killer had been named allowed memories of her life to surface without immediate intrusion. There were also moments of anger, sharp and unexpected, triggered by a song, a photograph, a passing remark. Justice, they learned, was not a cure but a context, a framework within which grief could be renegotiated. Support from the community persisted in quieter forms. Notes left anonymously. Donations made without fanfare. Small gestures that acknowledged the endurance of loss without demanding gratitude or closure. It was a collective attempt to honor the past without becoming trapped by it, a balance that required constant adjustment. The Ohio case also influenced how future investigations were framed publicly. Departments grew more cautious with language, less inclined to promise swift resolution, more transparent about uncertainty. The phrase cold case itself began to feel less like a verdict and more like a status, mutable rather than terminal. It suggested waiting rather than abandonment, a pause instead of an end. Technological advances continued unabated, new tools emerging that promised even greater precision. Facial recognition, advanced data analytics, machine learning applied to pattern recognition, all hovered at the edges of investigative practice, raising familiar questions about oversight and misuse. The Ohio case served as both encouragement and warning, proof that innovation could illuminate truth while also demanding restraint. For those who had worked the case across decades, retirement brought a complex mix of relief and unfinished emotion. They spoke about it in interviews and memoirs, careful to credit teams rather than individuals, to frame success as collective persistence rather than personal triumph. Many admitted that they had doubted, at times, that the case would ever be solved, that continuing to care had been an act of faith as much as professionalism. The road where it happened remained unmarked officially, a decision made to avoid turning tragedy into spectacle. Yet drivers who knew the story slowed unconsciously as they passed, a reflex born of respect rather than fear. The landscape absorbed the years without commentary, indifferent to human memory, while the people continued to carry it, shaped by an event that refused to remain neatly in the past. As the decades stretched further from 1987, the case's meaning continued to shift. It was no longer simply about a murder solved through modern forensics. It had become a meditation on time itself, on the way answers could arrive long after the questions had exhausted those who first asked them. It challenged the assumption that relevance decays predictably, that urgency fades with age. And in that challenge lay its enduring power. The Ohio cold case did not resolve into a neat moral or a triumphant finale. It settled instead into a deeper truth, one that resisted simplification. That justice, when it comes late, carries a different weight. That truth uncovered after years of silence speaks in a quieter voice, but one that demands careful listening. The story continued to ripple outward, touching institutions, individuals, and debates far removed from the original crime scene. It reminded everyone who encountered it that time can conceal, but it can also preserve, holding fragments intact until the moment arrives when they can finally be understood. And as those fragments surfaced again and again, they reinforced a single, unsettling idea. Nothing is ever truly lost to the past. It waits, embedded in evidence, in memory, in unanswered questions. And when the present finally has the means to listen, the past does not whisper. It speaks with the accumulated force of all the years it was forced to remain silent, insisting that even the longest cold cases are not endings, but suspensions, moments paused in time, waiting for the inevitable resumption of truth. The years following the resolution carried a strange duality, a sense that something had ended and yet nothing was truly over. The case no longer demanded action, but it continued to ask for interpretation, its meaning shifting depending on who was looking and when. For some, it became a cautionary tale about patience. For others, a warning about complacency. And for a few, it was something closer to a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths about how easily violence can coexist with normal life. In private conversations, detectives admitted that the arrest had changed how they listened. Tips that once would have been dismissed as too old, too vague, too unlikely now received a second glance. Memory, they had learned, did not decay evenly. Some details sharpened with time, others warped, and part of the work was learning how to distinguish between erosion and revelation. The Ohio case had taught them that belated clarity did not invalidate early confusion, it reframed it. The victim's story, retold in documentaries and long-form articles, gradually shifted focus. Early pieces had lingered on the shock, the brutality, the unanswered questions. Newer accounts slowed down, paying attention to the spaces between facts, to the long silence that followed the crime. Journalists described the years when nothing happened, when hope survived on routine updates and polite assurances. That silence, once overlooked, became central, recognized as part of the harm inflicted not just by the killer, but by the limits of the era. Former classmates and coworkers came forward with memories they had never shared publicly, small moments that now felt precious. A joke told during a break. A habit of humming while working. A kindness extended without ceremony. These details filled in the portrait that violence had flattened, restoring dimension to a life too often summarized by its end. In doing so, they subtly shifted the narrative away from spectacle and toward remembrance. The defendant's presence in the public imagination continued to fade, his name invoked less frequently, his image replaced by abstractions about accountability and consequence. This was not accidental. Community leaders made a conscious effort to avoid granting him further notoriety, redirecting attention whenever possible toward the systems that had failed and the people who had endured. It was a small but deliberate act of resistance against the gravitational pull of infamy. In academic circles, the case sparked renewed interest in the psychology of long undetected offenders. How they compartmentalized. How they navigated everyday relationships while carrying an unspoken history of violence. Researchers debated whether the absence of detection reinforced behavior or merely postponed reckoning. The Ohio case offered data but no definitive answers, only a reminder that human behavior rarely conforms to tidy models. The legal profession, too, continued to unpack the implications. Defense attorneys scrutinized the use of genealogy databases, refining arguments about consent and scope. Prosecutors refined protocols to ensure transparency and oversight, aware that public trust was as critical as scientific accuracy. The case became a touchstone in continuing education seminars, a reference invoked whenever boundaries were tested. Meanwhile, the town's physical landscape evolved. New businesses replaced old ones. Roads were widened, intersections redesigned. The places associated with the crime receded beneath layers of development, their significance invisible to newcomers. Yet for longtime residents, these changes carried a quiet poignancy, reminders that while the environment adapted, memory did not always follow at the same pace. There were moments when the case resurfaced unexpectedly, triggered by unrelated events. Another cold case solved elsewhere. A news story about advances in DNA analysis. Each time, the old feeling stirred, not with the same intensity, but with a familiarity that was impossible to ignore. The story had become part of the town's internal weather, something sensed rather than discussed, shaping reactions in subtle ways. For the victim's family, life continued in fragments of normalcy punctuated by sudden reminders. They navigated the tension between honoring her memory and asserting their own right to move forward. Some days, they welcomed questions, grateful that people still cared. Other days, they retreated, protective of a grief that no longer needed an audience. Their journey resisted neat arcs, unfolding instead in fits and starts, guided by instinct rather than expectation. Support organizations reached out, inviting them to speak at conferences and memorials, to lend their story to broader efforts aimed at reform and awareness. Sometimes they accepted, finding purpose in advocacy. Other times they declined, recognizing that participation came at a personal cost. Both choices were acts of agency reclaimed after years of waiting. The case also influenced how missing persons and homicide investigations were discussed publicly. Authorities grew more careful with absolutes, more willing to acknowledge uncertainty. The phrase "we will never know" lost some of its finality, replaced by language that left room for future discovery. It was a subtle shift, but one that mattered to families living in limbo. In conversations about justice, the Ohio case was often cited as proof that persistence mattered more than immediacy. Yet those closest to it understood the deeper truth: persistence without resources was hope without leverage. The case had survived because evidence was preserved, because someone had chosen not to discard what seemed useless, because institutional memory, however imperfect, had endured. That lesson echoed through departments struggling with limited budgets and overwhelming caseloads. As time passed, anniversaries grew quieter. Fewer speeches. Fewer articles. More private moments of reflection. The story no longer demanded collective attention to remain alive, it had been absorbed into the fabric of the place. People carried it forward individually, shaped by their own relationship to it, whether direct or inherited. The younger generation encountered the case differently, as history rather than lived experience. For them, the idea that a murder could remain unsolved for decades seemed both alarming and abstract. Teachers and parents used the story to bridge that gap, to explain how systems evolve, how certainty is sometimes a luxury of the present. In doing so, they framed the case not as an anomaly, but as a chapter in an ongoing narrative about progress and accountability. The road at night still felt empty, the darkness still deep, but the fear that once clung to it had thinned, replaced by a quieter vigilance. People understood now that danger did not announce itself, that it could hide behind familiarity and routine. This awareness did not paralyze, it sharpened, encouraging attention rather than panic. In reflective moments, some asked whether the outcome would have been different if the science had existed earlier. It was a question without a satisfying answer. What mattered more was the recognition that the tools of today would one day be obsolete too, that future investigators would look back on current methods with the same mixture of respect and frustration. The Ohio case served as a reminder to leave doors open, to assume that what seemed impossible now might be routine later. The story continued to circulate, not loudly, but persistently, shaping expectations and ethics in ways that were difficult to quantify. It became a quiet influence, a reference point invoked without explanation, understood by those who had followed it closely. Its power lay not in drama, but in endurance. And through that endurance, a final realization settled in, steady and unavoidable. Resolution did not arrive as a single moment, but as a gradual reorientation, a slow recalibration of how the past was held. The Ohio 1987 cold case had been solved, yes, but its true legacy unfolded over time, in altered practices, cautious optimism, and a deeper respect for the long, uncertain arc that connects violence, memory, and truth. The story did not fade. It transformed. And in that transformation, it continued to remind those who listened that justice is not only about answers, but about the willingness to keep the past within reach, ready to be confronted again when the moment, and the means, finally arrive. As the case settled into history, it began to surface in places far removed from the original crime scene, its influence diffusing outward like a signal carried on low frequency, detectable only to those attuned to its implications. Conferences on criminal justice referenced it in passing, not always by name, but as an example of a turning point, a moment when patience and technology intersected with moral resolve. The story became less about one murder and more about what persistence could yield when systems refused to forget. In forensic laboratories, technicians spoke about the Ohio case with a mix of respect and caution. It was cited as proof that meticulous preservation mattered, that even degraded samples could carry value decades later. But it was also used as a warning against overconfidence, a reminder that results must be contextualized, corroborated, and handled with care. The success had not erased the risk of error, it had highlighted the responsibility that came with new power. Training manuals were quietly updated, footnotes expanded, case studies added. Recruits learned not only how to collect evidence, but why it mattered to do so with an eye toward futures they could not yet imagine. Instructors emphasized continuity, the idea that an investigation did not belong solely to the people who opened it, but to everyone who might one day inherit it. The Ohio cold case became shorthand for that inheritance, a story passed along as both inspiration and obligation. The public discourse around crime shifted subtly as well. Audiences grew more skeptical of instant conclusions, more aware of the long timelines that often underlie resolution. True crime narratives, once dominated by cliffhangers and sensationalism, began to include more attention to process, to the years when nothing happened and patience was the only strategy available. The Ohio story contributed to that recalibration, its long silence as instructive as its eventual answer. For the victim's family, this broader attention was a double-edged presence. On one hand, it affirmed that her life and death had not been forgotten, that something meaningful had emerged from decades of waiting. On the other, it meant revisiting the story in new contexts, encountering it reframed and reinterpreted by strangers. They learned to navigate this exposure selectively, choosing when to engage and when to protect their private grief. Community remembrance evolved as well. Instead of vigils centered on loss, events began to focus on resilience, on the collective effort to support unsolved cases and the families bound to them. The victim's name was spoken alongside others, her story woven into a larger tapestry of remembrance that emphasized connection rather than isolation. It was a shift from singular tragedy to shared purpose. The defendant's continued absence from public conversation was itself a kind of statement. Without constant repetition, his image faded, his notoriety diluted by time and indifference. What remained was the impact of his actions, not the spectacle of his person. This reframing aligned with a growing movement to deny perpetrators the lasting attention they often seek, redirecting focus instead toward accountability and prevention. In legal scholarship, the case prompted renewed examination of statutes of limitations, particularly for violent crimes. Debates intensified around whether time should ever shield perpetrators from prosecution when evidence eventually becomes available. The Ohio case was cited as an argument for patience in the law itself, for frameworks that acknowledged both the inevitability of delay and the enduring right to justice. The town continued to change, its population turning over, its landmarks evolving. New residents encountered the story through local history projects and museum exhibits that contextualized it within broader social changes. These presentations avoided sensational detail, opting instead for reflection, inviting visitors to consider how communities remember and how they move forward without erasing what came before. There were moments when the case reemerged sharply, sparked by a new development elsewhere, a long missing person found, a decades-old homicide solved. Each time, comparisons were drawn, lessons extracted, and the Ohio example resurfaced as proof that time did not necessarily close doors. It was a refrain that offered comfort to some and impatience to others, depending on where they stood. For investigators still working unsolved cases, the story served as both encouragement and burden. Encouragement because it demonstrated that breakthroughs were possible. Burden because it raised expectations, creating pressure to replicate success in circumstances that might never align so cleanly. They spoke candidly about this tension, about the danger of allowing one triumph to overshadow the reality of many cases that might remain unresolved despite best efforts. The emotional resonance of the case also evolved. What had once been raw and immediate softened into something more contemplative. Anger gave way, in some quarters, to a quieter sorrow, a recognition that resolution did not reverse time. This emotional shift allowed for more nuanced conversations about harm, responsibility, and the limits of justice, conversations that had been difficult to sustain while the wound was still open. Artists and writers found their way to the story, drawn not by the violence but by the passage of time it embodied. Essays explored the concept of delayed truth. Poems reflected on evidence sleeping in boxes, waiting for a future it could not imagine. These interpretations extended the case's reach beyond law enforcement and into the realm of cultural memory, where its lessons took on metaphorical weight. The Ohio cold case also influenced policy discussions about data retention and privacy. As digital records became easier to store and analyze, questions arose about how long information should be kept and who should have access to it. The case provided a concrete example of why retention mattered, even as it underscored the need for safeguards to prevent misuse. It became a reference point in negotiations that balanced potential benefit against risk. Within the victim's extended family, younger members grew up hearing the story differently than their elders had lived it. For them, the crime was a chapter with an ending, not an ongoing uncertainty. This distinction shaped their relationship to it, allowing them to grieve without the added burden of not knowing. It did not diminish the loss, but it altered its texture, making it possible to integrate into identity rather than resist. As the years moved further away from both the crime and its resolution, the case's legacy continued to unfold. It influenced how evidence was stored, how investigations were revisited, how patience was valued. It lingered in professional standards and personal memories alike, a quiet but persistent presence. The story's power lay in its refusal to conform to expectations. It did not deliver redemption or restoration. It offered something more restrained and, in its own way, more honest. A recognition that justice could arrive late and still matter, that truth uncovered after decades still had the capacity to alter the present. In that recognition, the Ohio 1987 cold case found its enduring place. Not as a headline, not as a spectacle, but as a reminder etched into institutional memory and human experience alike. It stood as evidence that waiting did not always mean forgetting, that silence did not always equal absence, and that the past, however distant, retained the ability to speak with clarity when the moment finally arrived. And so the story continued, not in dramatic turns, but in the steady accumulation of influence, shaping decisions and perspectives in ways that were often invisible but deeply consequential. The cold case had warmed, yes, but its heat was not explosive. It was steady, enduring, a slow burn that illuminated the long shadow cast by a single night and the many years it took for truth to emerge from it. Time did what it always does after the noise fades. It moved forward without ceremony, carrying the case with it into a quieter phase, one where answers existed but consequences unfolded slowly, almost invisibly. The courtroom drama that many had imagined never arrived in the way they expected. There were no daily headlines, no shouting crowds, no cinematic confession delivered under harsh lights. Instead, there was procedure. Paperwork. Closed doors. Justice, when it finally came into view, wore the plain clothes of bureaucracy. Behind those doors, prosecutors revisited the case file with a precision sharpened by decades of hindsight. Every statement was reread, every inconsistency weighed not against urgency, but against permanence. They understood the stakes were different now. A modern forensic identification did not erase the need for narrative integrity. It had to fit. It had to hold. It had to survive scrutiny not just from defense attorneys, but from history itself. The suspect, now named and documented, existed in a strange limbo. Identified, but not yet fully confronted by the public eye. His life, built in the long shadow of an unresolved crime, was dissected quietly. Employment records. Residences. Relationships. Patterns that once seemed ordinary were reinterpreted through a darker lens. A move across state lines. A sudden job change. A year that could not be fully accounted for. Details that had once been meaningless now took on weight. Investigators compared timelines with renewed focus, overlaying the suspect's movements onto the geography of the crime like transparent sheets. The overlaps were subtle, never definitive on their own, but collectively unsettling. He had been close. Close enough to matter. Close enough to make coincidence feel like an insult to logic. Each confirmation tightened the narrative, drawing the past into sharper relief. Yet even now, certainty was handled with restraint. This was not the era of rushed indictments. The lesson of the cold case had been absorbed too deeply. Prosecutors knew that the same patience that had preserved the evidence must now guide its presentation. They waited. They verified. They consulted independent experts who had no stake in the outcome beyond accuracy. The victim's family was brought back into the process with care. Meetings were scheduled privately, explanations delivered without jargon, timelines laid out with honesty. They were told what was known, what was strongly suspected, and what remained unprovable. There were no promises made about closure. Only clarity. Only respect for the complexity of what lay ahead. For them, hearing the suspect's name spoken aloud was a moment both grounding and disorienting. A name gave shape to decades of abstraction, but it also collapsed time. Grief that had settled into routine suddenly surged forward, raw and immediate. The years between the crime and this moment dissolved, leaving only the echo of loss and the ache of finally knowing where to direct it. Outside, word began to spread in controlled fragments. A briefing here. A carefully worded statement there. Journalists sensed the shift immediately. This was no longer just a solved cold case, it was a test of the justice system's ability to act after so much delay. Every outlet wanted the angle that would define the story. Some emphasized the science. Others focused on the weight. A few lingered uncomfortably on the suspect himself, probing his past for signs that had gone unnoticed. The community responded with a mix of vindication and fatigue. There was relief, yes, but also a quiet resentment toward the time that had been lost. People asked questions they had learned to suppress. Could this have been solved sooner? Were there moments when the answer had been close but overlooked? These questions had no clean resolution. They hovered in conversation, acknowledged but unanswered. As legal preparations continued, defense strategies took shape in parallel. Experts were consulted to challenge the reliability of decades-old evidence, to argue contamination, degradation, coincidence. It was a predictable response, but no less formidable for it. Prosecutors anticipated these arguments, preparing counterpoints rooted in methodical documentation and cross-verification. The case was becoming a contest not just of facts, but of philosophies about time, memory, and proof. In this phase, the cold case revealed its final complexity. Solving it had been only the first step. Translating that solution into accountability required navigating a system not designed for such long arcs. Witnesses had died. Records had been lost. Context had shifted. The law moved forward, but it carried the weight of everything it had missed. Amid these developments, the victim's story risked being overshadowed once again. Advocates and family members worked deliberately to keep her at the center of the narrative. They spoke about who she had been, not just how she had died. About her routines, her ambitions, the small details that humanized a case too often reduced to forensic milestones. This effort grounded the proceedings, reminding everyone involved that the purpose of justice was not procedural victory, but recognition of harm. Public forums and panel discussions revisited the case with renewed intensity. Criminologists debated its implications. Ethicists questioned how society should balance the promise of future technology against the limitations of present action. The Ohio case became a touchstone, invoked in arguments about funding, training, and institutional memory. It was no longer just an example of success, it was a mirror reflecting unresolved tensions within the system. The suspect's arrest, when it finally came, was subdued. No dramatic chase. No defiant speech. Just a knock on a door, a reading of rights, a moment when decades of anonymity ended quietly. Images surfaced briefly, then receded. The spectacle many had imagined failed to materialize, replaced by something more unsettling, the ordinariness of it all. That ordinariness forced a reckoning. The idea that someone could move through life unnoticed, while carrying responsibility for an unsolved murder challenged comforting narratives about monsters and villains. It suggested instead a reality where harm could coexist with normalcy, where justice depended not on obvious evil, but on persistent attention. As the legal process advanced, delays accumulated. Motions were filed. Hearings postponed. Each pause tested the patience of those who had waited so long already. But this time, waiting felt different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with purpose, with momentum that, however slow, moved in a discernible direction. The community watched with cautious engagement. Some attended hearings. Others avoided coverage entirely, unable to relive the story yet again. There was no single way to process a resolution so delayed. The only commonality was the awareness that something fundamental had shifted, that the story was no longer defined by absence. In private moments, investigators reflected on their role in this final act. Many would never take another case of similar scope. For them, the Ohio cold case represented both the pinnacle and the end of an era. It affirmed the value of their work while reminding them of its limits. They had helped uncover the truth, but they could not control how it would be received or remembered. As the trial loomed, the narrative reached a strange equilibrium. The mystery had narrowed, but uncertainty remained. The outcome was not yet written, and the past refused to align neatly with the present. The case hovered on the edge of resolution, suspended between what was known and what could be proven. In that suspension, the true weight of the cold case became clear. It was not just a story about a crime solved late. It was about endurance, of evidence, of memory, of people who refused to let silence be the final word. And as the next chapter prepared to unfold, one truth stood undeniable: the years had not buried the crime. They had only deepened its imprint, ensuring that when justice finally spoke, it would do so with the full gravity of time behind it. The trial did not begin with drama. It began with silence, the kind that settles into a courtroom when everyone present understands that what is about to be said carries the weight of decades. Wooden benches creaked softly as people shifted, reporters lowered their voices, and the judge's entrance felt less like a formality and more like a signal that time itself was being called to order. This was not just a legal proceeding. It was a confrontation between past and present, staged under fluorescent lights. Opening statements avoided theatrics. Prosecutors spoke carefully, almost reverently, as if afraid that raising their voices might fracture the fragile bridge connecting 1987 to now. They laid out the chronology without embellishment, letting the long gaps speak for themselves. A night. A body. Evidence collected and sealed. Years of unanswered questions. Then, slowly, the emergence of modern forensics, not as a miracle, but as a continuation of work that had never truly stopped. The defense countered with a different tone. Measured skepticism. Emphasis on doubt. They reminded the jury, repeatedly, of the time that had passed, of memories eroded, of evidence that had lived in boxes longer than some jurors had been alive. They framed the case as a cautionary tale, warning against the temptation to let new technology rewrite old uncertainty. Their argument was simple and unsettling: time does not just obscure guilt, it can manufacture it. As testimony began, the courtroom became a vessel for voices drawn from different eras. Retired officers took the stand, their uniforms replaced by suits, their hair gray, their recollections precise in some places and blurred in others. They spoke of procedures that were standard then but outdated now, of instincts they trusted because there was nothing else to rely on. Cross-examination was gentle, almost respectful, acknowledging the limitations of the past without assigning blame. Forensic experts followed, bringing the language of the present into sharp contrast. They explained DNA analysis step by step, translating complex processes into terms meant to build trust rather than awe. Charts illuminated the walls. Probabilities were quantified. Matches described with statistical certainty. Yet even here, restraint dominated. No one claimed perfection. The science was powerful, yes, but it was framed as one piece of a larger mosaic. When physical evidence was displayed, it carried an unexpected emotional charge. Objects once mundane, a piece of fabric, a preserved sample, now stood as survivors of time. They had endured neglect, skepticism, technological limitation, and still remained. The jury watched closely, aware that these fragments had outlasted witnesses, trends, even institutional confidence. They were relics, but also messengers. The victim's family sat quietly through these moments, absorbing details they had learned long ago and others they were hearing for the first time. Each revelation was a reopening, each confirmation a small wound layered atop an old scar. They had prepared themselves for this, but preparation did not blunt impact. It only gave it structure. When character witnesses were called, the contrast sharpened further. Friends and acquaintances of the victim spoke of routines interrupted, of absences that never resolved into memory. They described a life frozen at the moment it was taken, a person who never aged in their recollection. The courtroom listened, reminded that while evidence could be preserved, potential could not. Then came the testimony that shifted the atmosphere entirely. A forensic genealogist explained how the suspect had been identified through family connections, through distant relatives unaware they were part of a search. The explanation was technical but carried ethical weight. Questions arose about consent, about privacy, about the boundaries of investigation in a digital age. The judge allowed the discussion to unfold, understanding its significance beyond this single case. The defense seized on these points, pressing hard. They argued intrusion. They argued precedent. They suggested a slippery slope where the pursuit of justice might overreach. The prosecution responded by returning to the victim, to the necessity of using available tools responsibly when traditional methods had failed. It was a debate not just about this crime, but about the future of law enforcement itself. Outside the courtroom, public reaction intensified. Opinion pieces flooded media outlets, some praising the perseverance that had brought the case this far, others warning of a system too eager to declare victory. Social media amplified every development, often stripping nuance in favor of certainty. The case, once quiet and forgotten, now existed everywhere at once. Inside, the judge maintained a steady hand, limiting spectacle, insisting on relevance. Days blurred together as testimony accumulated. Jurors took notes, their expressions revealing little. They were aware that they were being asked to decide something rare and heavy, whether truth uncovered late could still meet the standard of proof. The defendant himself remained largely still throughout the proceedings. No outbursts. No visible reactions. His presence was almost ghost-like, a reminder that accountability does not always arrive with emotion attached. Observers searched his face for signs, regret, defiance, fear, but found mostly neutrality. It unsettled many more than anger would have. As closing arguments approached, tension condensed. Prosecutors summarized the case as a chain unbroken by time, each link reinforced by the next. They urged the jury to see the decades not as a weakness, but as context, proof that the pursuit of truth had never ceased. They asked for trust, not in technology alone, but in the convergence of evidence and reason. The defense closed by returning to doubt. They spoke of erosion, of the danger of retrofitting certainty onto an incomplete past. They reminded the jury that the burden of proof had not changed just because the wait had been long. Justice delayed, they argued, risked becoming justice distorted. When deliberations began, the courtroom emptied slowly, as if reluctant to release the energy that had built there. Outside, the community waited again, but this time with an edge sharpened by proximity to resolution. The years of uncertainty had trained them for patience, but the immediacy of decision introduced a new kind of strain. Jurors debated quietly, methodically. They weighed science against skepticism, empathy against objectivity. Some struggled with the idea of judging actions so distant in time. Others focused on the clarity of the evidence as it existed now. The discussions were intense but respectful, driven by the shared understanding that their verdict would echo far beyond the room. Hours stretched into days. Each delay sparked speculation. Each silence amplified anxiety. For the family, this was the final endurance test. They had survived the not knowing. Now they faced the possibility of knowing and still not receiving validation. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom filled once more. The air felt heavier, charged with consequence. Everyone rose. Everyone waited. In that suspended moment, before words could reshape decades of memory, the full arc of the cold case converged. This was not the end of the story. It was the moment when the past asked the present to decide what it meant. And whatever the verdict would be, one truth had already asserted itself with unyielding clarity: time had not erased the crime. It had carried it here, intact, demanding to be seen, weighed, and answered at last. The verdict was delivered without flourish. No dramatic pause engineered for effect, no audible gasp timed for cameras. Just words, spoken clearly, firmly, landing in the room like a final weight set down after a journey that had lasted most of a lifetime. In that instant, the courtroom ceased to be a place of argument and became a place of consequence. Whatever uncertainty had lived here for decades now had a shape, a decision, a point of no return. For the victim's family, the sound of the verdict did not feel like relief rushing in. It felt like pressure releasing slowly, unevenly, in places they did not know were still holding tension. Some closed their eyes. Some stared straight ahead, refusing to look at the defendant, refusing to give him even that final acknowledgement. Tears came, but not the kind seen in movies. These were quiet, contained, almost private, the result of a grief that had learned discipline over years of waiting. The defendant absorbed the outcome with the same stillness he had shown throughout the trial. No visible reaction. No collapse. No protest. The absence of emotion unsettled many in the room more than rage ever could. It reinforced a truth that had grown harder to ignore as the case unfolded: accountability does not always arrive with catharsis. Sometimes it arrives with silence, and the silence is the sentence. As the judge spoke, outlining the formal consequences, the language returned to procedure, to statutes and schedules, to terms that belonged to the present, not the night in 1987 when everything began. Yet the past lingered in every word, an unspoken presence shaping the meaning of each phrase. This was justice expressed through structure, through order imposed long after chaos had taken its toll. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different. Reporters gathered, microphones raised, waiting for reactions that struggled to form. Some family members declined to speak, choosing distance over soundbites. Others offered brief statements, carefully composed, emphasizing remembrance rather than victory. They spoke the victim's name. They described her as more than a case, more than a headline, more than a scientific success story. In doing so, they reclaimed the narrative one final time. The community responded in fragments. Some felt vindicated, a confirmation that persistence mattered, that the system, however slow, could still function. Others felt a quieter unease, aware that no verdict could restore what had been lost, that decades of absence could not be retroactively repaired. Conversations reflected this split, moving between gratitude and exhaustion, between belief and lingering doubt. In the days that followed, analysis flooded in. Legal experts dissected the implications. Forensic specialists debated the standards set by the case. Ethicists revisited the questions raised by genealogical investigation. The Ohio 1987 cold case became a reference point once more, not for its mystery now, but for its resolution and the price that resolution demanded in patience, restraint, and trust. Training programs incorporated the outcome into curricula, emphasizing the importance of evidence stewardship across generations. Policy discussions referenced the case when arguing for funding, for modernization, for databases designed to endure. The verdict did not close these conversations. It intensified them, grounding abstract debates in a concrete example of what was at stake when time and truth collided. For investigators who had spent years carrying the case, the aftermath brought an unexpected emptiness. The file that had followed them from desk to desk, from assignment to assignment, was finally closed. Some described it as relief. Others as loss. The case had been a constant, a reminder of unfinished work. Without it, they were left to reckon with what its conclusion meant for their own careers, their own belief in the long game of justice. Within the victim's family, life adjusted again, settling into a new configuration. The unknown that had once dominated their grief was gone, replaced by a certainty that demanded its own processing. They learned that answers did not end mourning, they changed its rhythm. There were moments of peace they had not felt before, and moments of anger sharpened by the clarity of knowing exactly who was responsible. The town continued forward, as towns always do. Streets were repaved. Businesses changed hands. New families moved in, unaware at first of the history beneath their routines. But the story remained, preserved in local archives, in memorials, in the quiet way older residents paused when the case was mentioned. It had become part of the town's identity, not as a wound left open, but as a scar that testified to endurance. Years from now, the Ohio 1987 cold case would still be referenced, but differently. Not as an unsolved mystery. Not as a cautionary tale frozen in uncertainty. It would be remembered as proof that the past could be confronted even after decades of silence, that evidence could wait, that truth could survive neglect and still speak with authority. Yet even in resolution, the story refused to offer comfort wrapped in simplicity. There was no lesson neat enough to fit on a plaque. Only an understanding, hard-earned and unresolved, justice is not an event. It is a process stretched across time, shaped by human limits, dependent on those willing to keep listening when the world has moved on. The cold case had warmed, yes, but it had not vanished. Its legacy lived on in protocols rewritten, in families still healing, in investigators still chasing answers elsewhere. It lived on as a reminder that every piece of evidence carries a future, and every unanswered question carries weight. And somewhere between the night it all began and the day the verdict was spoken, the truth had waited. Not patiently. Not quietly. But persistently. held in fragments, stored in silence, preserved against forgetting. In the end, that persistence proved stronger than time. And that is what remains, long after the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded, the knowledge that even the coldest case can still burn, that memory can outlast neglect, and that the past, no matter how distant, never truly stops asking to be heard. Long after the courthouse lights went dark, after the last reporter packed away their equipment and the final transcript was filed, the case continued to exist in quieter spaces. In evidence rooms where shelves still held boxes labeled with dates that felt impossibly distant. In classrooms where instructors paused mid-lecture to reference a crime that had outlived the methods once used to solve it. In living rooms where families watched late-night news and felt something shift inside them, a recognition that time did not always win. The Ohio case stopped being a headline and became a reference point, invoked not with excitement, but with gravity. It entered conversations the way cautionary stories do, not to entertain, but to warn and to instruct. Investigators spoke of it when debating whether to discard old evidence. Administrators cited it when budgets were questioned. It became a quiet argument against forgetting, a reminder that today's dead end might be tomorrow's doorway. In forensic science, its influence deepened. Laboratories reviewed their archives with new attention, reassessing what had once been deemed unusable. Protocols were rewritten to prioritize longevity over convenience, preservation over speed. Evidence, once treated as a snapshot of a moment, was now understood as a message meant for the future. The Ohio case had proven that the future would eventually listen. The ripple extended into technology itself. Software developers working on forensic databases referenced the case when designing systems meant to endure decades of updates. Data integrity, chain of custody, and compatibility across generations became priorities rather than afterthoughts. The crime had revealed a simple truth: progress meant nothing if it could not reach backward as well as forward. For families of other unsolved cases, the story carried a complicated hope. It did not promise resolution. It did not guarantee answers. But it disrupted the finality of silence. Support groups referenced it cautiously, aware of the pain that false expectation could bring. Still, its existence mattered. It suggested that waiting, however brutal, was not the same as being forgotten. The victim's name surfaced less often now, but when it did, it was spoken with intention. Memorial events shifted tone, focusing less on unanswered questions and more on endurance. Her story became a thread in a larger fabric, connecting cases separated by geography and time. She was no longer alone in memory. She was part of a lineage of lives whose absence had demanded accountability from the future. In the town itself, the places tied to the crime lost their sharpness. What had once been a location heavy with dread became just another stretch of road, another building repurposed by necessity. Yet residents knew. They carried the knowledge quietly, the way communities carry storms they have survived. The story lived not in fear anymore, but in awareness. New investigators joined departments having only read about the case, never felt its weight in real time. For them, it was history, but a living kind, one that shaped how they approached their own work. They learned early that a file was never truly finished, that closure was provisional, that the past had a habit of resurfacing when given the chance. The defendant, now absorbed into the system he had avoided for so long, faded from public consciousness. His name appeared only in official documents, stripped of narrative, reduced to record. This disappearance felt intentional, almost corrective. The story no longer needed him at its center. It had moved on to something larger than one person's guilt. As years passed, the Ohio cold case took on a quieter authority. It was cited less often, but with more respect. Its lessons became embedded, no longer debated, simply assumed. Evidence was kept longer. Cases were reopened more readily. Patience became policy rather than exception. Yet for all its institutional impact, the case's most profound legacy remained human. It lived in the subtle shift of how people understood justice, not as a moment of triumph, but as a commitment stretched thin across time. It reframed expectations, teaching that resolution might arrive stripped of spectacle, that truth could emerge without restoring what had been lost. There were nights when those closest to the case still thought about the beginning. The unanswered phone calls. The early searches. The years when hope had felt reckless. These memories did not vanish with the verdict. They settled into place, part of a story now complete, but not erased. Completion did not mean forgetting. It meant integration. In archives, the case file sat closed, but not dormant. It was requested. Studied. Cited. Its pages bore the marks of many hands, many eras, each contributing something different. Together, they told a story not just of a crime, but of a system learning, adapting, refusing to surrender to time. And somewhere within that story was a quiet, enduring truth. That justice does not always arrive on schedule. That silence can be misleading. That answers can wait decades and still matter. The Ohio 1987 cold case did not end when the verdict was read. It continued, reshaping how absence was understood and how persistence was measured. In the end, what remained was not the shock of discovery or the drama of resolution, but something steadier. A recognition that even after years of darkness, fragments could still align. That memory could outlast neglect. That the past, no matter how distant, remained reachable. The case had begun with a night that stole a future. It ended with a present willing to look back without flinching. And in that long arc, stretched thin across decades, the cold case left behind its final mark, not as a mystery, not as a headline, but as proof that time, for all its power, does not get the last word.